So welcome everybody. This is the San Diego Union-Tribune's first parent webinar in our distance learning series. I'm Kristen Takeda and I cover K-12 education for the UT. Thank you all for joining us. We wanted to offer these webinars for parents because we know figuring out distance learning and homeschooling is really difficult. So these webinars will offer you some concrete tips and insights from experts about what to do, how to help your children, and how to help yourself during these tough times. I also wanted to let you know really quickly that we will be having a second webinar next week. It will be on Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. and that one will be focused on special education. So we've asked experts to discuss what are students and parents' rights during school closures and what you should do if you think your children aren't receiving all of their services. So I invite you to sign up for that next webinar as well. I believe the link will be available tomorrow. So please check our Distance Learning 101 page on our website. Okay, so I will start today's webinar, which will be about the basics of distance learning. We have 3 experts and each of them will give you a presentation of what they have to say, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So I will save all questions toward the end, but feel free to type any questions you have using the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will ask them all at the end. So yeah, let's get started. Our first speaker is Douglas Fisher. He is a professor and chair of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College Charter School. He has received several awards, including merits from the International Reading Association and the National Council of Teachers of English. He has also published numerous articles and books on how to improve student achievement, including the Distance Learning Playbook, which was published a few months ago, and that talks about how teachers can provide effective distance learning. So yes, I will pass it off to you, Doug, right now.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for your partnership with teachers across our world. So yes, we have a new playbook for parents, helping you think through your child's academic, social, and emotional development at these times. My website is fisherandfry.com, and you'll find lots of resources there. Until there's a cure, I think we've all realized there'll be some forms of distance learning. I think that's probably why you're all here. We may go back to school physically, part-time, full-time, in a week, out a week, but we're probably going to need to think through distance learning. And I believe we should say clearly and honestly that in the spring of 2020, March, April, May, we were pandemic teaching, we were crisis teaching, or we were quarantine teaching. We weren't really distance learning. We were thrown into this and we did a really good job. And I'd like to honor all the school systems that I've worked with for their heroic efforts to get kids opportunities to learn. But now we can do better. There's this talk of this gap year, that between March and June, students didn't learn all the things they were supposed to learn. And we're talking about this and like, we need to remediate kids. And I feel like this is a very dangerous conversation to have, that we don't want to focus on all the deficits. We want to focus on instead accelerating. How can we accelerate based on what kids need to learn right now? There have been other school closures in our world. There were the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand, the bushfires in Australia, Hurricane Katrina, Puerto Rico. Schools have closed before, not on this scale in our lifetimes, but they have. And what we learn from those pandemics and the research that's been published is when you dive deep into what kids actually need to learn right now, there's very little learning loss because then you can focus on acceleration. One of my colleagues, John Hattie, collects research from around the world. At this point, his database represents more than 300 million kids. And he's created this effect size monitor, like how powerful is something? And when you look at acceleration, the effect is really powerful. Remediation is much lower. We don't want to focus on remediation. We want to focus on accelerating. And now that I've quoted John Hattie, I would like to recognize that the effect size of distance learning is very low. And there are hundreds of studies about distance learning. And people are worried about this and they're saying, wow, the effect size of distance learning is so low. Will my kid actually learn? So what does it mean to have a distance learning effect size so low? What it means is, in studies comparing physical school from distance learning, not crisis teaching, not the emergencies that we had before, but planned and purposeful distance learning. It's not an accelerator, and it wasn't a negative. The setting in all of those studies, the setting was not the deciding factor. It's what the teachers did and the partnerships they formed with families. That's what got kids actually learning. So I hope we can move from crisis teaching to cohesive instruction. And I believe the school systems all over our county are ready to go. We have invested in teacher knowledge, teacher expertise, teacher materials. We are ready to launch new experiences for your children in distance learning. So I've been working on this, and I have an advisory group of parents that I've been working through, and surveys of parents, and lots of information. A couple of basics, some things we would appreciate as educators if you could help us out with. If at all possible, we would love to have your kids dressed and ready for school. So they're in the mindset, it's still school. And as parents, if you could reestablish routines, it would be very helpful. What is the morning routine? What is the end of day routine? If we could have routines again, and students are ready for school, and they're physically and emotionally ready to be school, it's helpful. If possible, have a dedicated workspace for your child, a place where they physically go and they say, this is my learning environment now. It's really good for their brains. Their behavior is in part determined by the environment. And so if we say, this is where the learning environment is, and this is how we act when we're in the learning environment, super helpful for us as teachers. If possible, let's not have it in the bedroom. There's a difference there, like what happened, sleeping and that kind of stuff. So we're trying to be outside the bedroom, if at all possible. It would be helpful for us. Please make sure your child is getting sufficient sleep. I suspect that many of us lost our routines in the first part of the pandemic, and kids were staying up really, really late. Our children need some sleep. They need a good amount of sleep so their brain consolidates and builds those memories. And that seems like a super basic reminder, but we're seeing a lot of kids who are showing up exhausted to their class meetings. They stayed up too late. They were not getting sufficient sleep. This is going to be important. How can we reestablish routines? How can we reestablish sleep patterns? How can we set our kids up for success? How can we do some very basic things to set those school days up to get the most impact possible? On video chats, we're looking for specific actions if possible. So one of my colleagues in Fresno modified this MAC activity chart for younger kids to say, during a video chat, if you're 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old, here's the movement we're looking for, here's the activity we're looking for, here are the kinds of conversations we're looking for. And we're seeing a lot of school systems create posters so that you can have these in your home so your kid has a visual reminder of, here's what I'm supposed to be doing during a video chat. And if possible, could you not vacuum in the background while your kid's on video chats with their class? I know that seems like a lot to ask, but we're getting a lot of distractions. And I know there's some realities that we all are dealing with, but we're trying to get our kids in a learning space. Very basic things. And then I want to think about the values, the value of your time. If you have a little time, what could get the best return on investment? I'm not asking you to be the teacher. There is a teacher. We need to engage that teacher, partner with that teacher, communicate with that teacher. But if you have time and you can help, one of the things we should be doing is getting kids to read a lot. The effective schools research shows that schools that are effective have children eyes on text on average 90 minutes a day. Across the school day, different kinds of reading, but on average 90 minutes per day. In the pandemic teaching days, I think that volume dropped considerably and kids were not doing sufficient reading. Reading builds your background knowledge. Reading builds your vocabulary. In fact, reading is the best predictor we have for whether or not you understand the future background knowledge that you need. So reading a lot matters. If we could get a little bit of help with getting kids to actually read, whatever their age is, set the goal. How much reading? Not all at once necessarily. Could we parse it out so we can build that volume of reading? the total volume of reading your child does will correlate to their overall achievement in school. Second, vocabulary, a significant predictor of comprehension. Does the kid know enough words? Have we focused enough? Now, the teachers are going to teach a lot of words, but if you could play vocabulary games, put some apps on your phone or your iPad to play vocabulary games, that would be a tremendous help. By ninth grade, your child needs to know 88,500 word families. So like information, disinformation, informative, that's a word family. That translates to 500,000 words. To be at grade level, you need to know a lot of vocabulary. And so if you can help teach some vocabulary, practice the vocabulary, play vocabulary games, that would be really helpful. Oral language, talking, speaking and listening, very powerful for the learning of young people. The evidence on this says that for the vast majority of children, their listening comprehension sets the maximum ceiling of their reading. You can't have reading comprehension exceed their listening comprehension. So the more you have conversations, the more you read things and talk about them, the more things you talk about your day and you build all of the different conversations. If you can build the listening comprehension and the oral language of your children, when the teachers work on reading, the levels of reading will improve. See, that brain doesn't hardwire to read. There is no reading gene that gets passed from one generation to the next. Every brain has to be taught to read all over again. And almost all of us use the same parts of our brain to speak and listen as we do to read. So the stronger those pathways are around speaking and listening, the more potential we have for reading. So please spend time talking, interacting, discussing. Building oral language is powerful. We could also appreciate if you could get some practice. When the teachers assign practice work, it's not for compliance, it's because practice helps learn. I think you know this when you think about things like sports or musical instruments. You have to practice. Practice doesn't make it perfect. Practice makes it permanent. We need to ensure sufficient practice. Are we getting the student practicing, so that amazing instruction actually sticks? So if you could help, actually get your student, your child, to do the practice work, that learning will move forward. That learning will accelerate. Here are some of the principles from the research on deliberate practice. We have to get the assignments to push beyond your child's current comfort zone. They should work on specific goals. They need to focus on those practice activities. They need feedback from you, from the teacher, to develop a mental model of what expertise looks like, whether that's playing soccer, playing a piano, or doing calculus. A mental model of expertise with feedback and focus and specific goals and pushing beyond. That's why the teachers are assigning all that practice work, not just for random points to get things done, because the practice allows it to stick. Another message I like to share with you. Struggle is good. Productive struggle is good for learning. It's good for our brains. It's helpful in the learning process. I think we might not have communicated this as clearly to all families. Allow your child to struggle. Don't tell them the answers. Don't do the work for them. It's not a checklist to get done. It's about learning. If your kid is struggling a lot, talk to the teacher. The teacher can schedule some small group sessions and do some more scaffolding and support. But if we remove the struggle, if we take away all the struggle and you help too much, the worry is we will create learned helplessness, that we won't provide sufficient support to grapple with ideas, to grapple with problems, to figure things out. We want to make sure there's a healthy dose of struggling. However, as your child does the tasks, you should feel free to provide hints. In academics, we call them prompts and cues. Hints. You can provide hints. Provide little prompts, we call them, or little cues, we call them. Hints. That's great. Hints are no problem. But let your child do the thinking and the work. And again, if your kid struggles a lot with something, communicate with the teacher or advocate for your child to communicate with the teacher. So we can schedule additional small group sessions to unlock that. Also, think about your child's well-being. The things that are on my mind are around socialization and friendships and things like conflict resolution. How do we maintain some of those human connections? How will you encourage your child to socialize with other people, even if it has to be from a distance? How will you ensure your child maintains those friendships and social connections, even from a distance? And when conflicts occur, how will we resolve those conflicts? How can we teach conflict resolution from a distance? Well-being is going to be really important as we recover from this and as we return more normal. We have to maintain those human connections that we have with one another. And my last set of recommendations in the resources we've provided for families is around building some mind frames. What are the mind frames we would like? Not the daily lessons, but across time, what are the big mind frames that we should have? So our review of research on mind frames, what we hope your child develops over time, and if you can help build these habits, super powerful. Does your child know the current level of understanding? Does your child know what he or she already knows? That's important to recognize where you are in the learning journey. Does your child know what they're learning next? Likely the teacher will give objectives or learning targets. Embrace those. Talk about those. That's where we're going. And how can we build some confidence so your child can take on the challenge? The challenge is important. The challenge helps us learn. Third, how can we teach your child to select tools to guide their learning? The teacher will likely provide several tools, many different tools. Some will be technology, some will be more paper, pen, and pencil. How can your child learn to say, this tool, this process, this strategy will help me learn this? It shouldn't always be the teacher telling your child how to learn something. Study skills, for example. Which study skills are going to help you? Let the kid have some opportunity to select. Teach your child to seek out feedback, not wait passively for it. See, we send a lot of feedback, teachers give a lot of feedback, but the only feedback that works is feedback that is received. And the best way we know how to get feedback to be received is to teach kids to ask for it. Where do you need feedback? What do you need feedback on? What would helpful feedback look like? And the second part of that one is celebrate errors. Errors are opportunities to learn. If an hour goes by and there are no errors, your child knew all that already. Here's one of the little dirty secrets in school that we don't talk about that much. The research says that on average, about 40% of instructional minutes are spent on things kids already have learned. In distance learning, we don't have time for that. What we need to focus on is what your kid needs to learn right now. That means errors will be part of the process. Celebrate that. Recognize that. Errors are the opportunity to learn. Next, have design tools. Use the tools that teachers give you for your child to monitor progress. How am I doing? Am I a pro at it? Am I like a level 4? Am I still learning it? Am I an apprentice? I'm a novice. Ask your child, what did you learn today? How much learning did you do? What was the best question you asked today? How do you know you're learning things? Change that dialogue with your child so they learn to monitor and adjust. And lastly, encourage your child to recognize when they learn things and invite them to teach others. Teach grandma, teach aunts and uncles, teach someone what you've learned. The evidence on this is very powerful for transfer when children have opportunities to teach others what they've learned. Set up those opportunities. Have your child teach you, the siblings, the family. teach other people. There's even evidence for young kids that reading to stuffed animals and pets is good practice because those things don't judge you, and they start to learn to teach others. If we could develop these mind frames, if you could help a little bit support that teacher, if you could get your child reading, doing the practice work, not telling them answers, allowing the struggle, your child will learn. The teacher's superpower is to recognize that learning is a journey. Your child is on a journey. We will know where your kid is. We will create lessons to move that learning forward. We're partners in this. We're together on this. Let's start the year with confidence. If you have doubts about distance learning, please don't share them right now with your child. Approach this year with confidence. We can do this. We can support the learning of all children. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doug, for sharing. Really appreciate that. Okay, our next speaker is Jackie York. Jackie is an online teacher leader for Springs Charter Schools, a Southern California network of schools that specializes in homeschooling and blended learning. Jackie has a master's degree in elementary education and began a PhD program in curriculum, instruction, and assessment while working as a homeschool mentor and administrator for Springs Charter. She is also an associate professor in the Graduate Studies Teacher Prep program at Hope International University. Jackie has years of experience working with homeschoolers, and she has personally homeschooled her own 3 children through high school graduation. So yeah, I will pass this on to Jackie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Welcome, parents. I know that this year is different than we all imagined, and distance learning might not have been on your radar, and that might have not been the educational plan that you had for your kids, but we can really make this a really great year. It's true that things are different. So for students, they're still going to school, right? They're just not going to school with their friends. And teachers are still teaching. They're just teaching to a screen. But you as parents, you now have multiple roles, and we recognize that. So you're going to help support the teacher, maybe do some tutoring, provide intervention, provide tech support, classroom monitoring, recess duty, and there's no principal's office to send the kids to either. So the first thing I just want to share with you is that, as Doug mentioned, and such great content that Doug shared with all of us already, that just remember you don't have to do this perfectly. Just enter into this year. In fact, I guarantee you won't do it perfectly, but be open-minded and optimistic, and just show up for your kids every day and do your best. And so I have, as I mentioned, years of homeschooling experience. I've also been an online teacher, and I'm currently an online teacher with the distance learning program that's been planned, that's been in place for over 6 years. And distance learning is and can be a very viable option for kids. And so we just want to share, the purpose of this webinar and the other speakers is to share with you some real practical tips from the trade to help you and help this year go smoother. So we're in this together, as Doug mentioned. I'm having a little technical difficulty. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do is just get a little feedback from you about what's on your mind. So in the chat, there's actually a link that you can use if you could click on that. Or if you are watching from your computer and you have a phone available, you can go to the URL that's on the screen there, www.menti.com, and you can just enter in that code. And there's just a question there for you to answer. And I'm just curious, what's the biggest thing that's on your mind right now as it relates to distance learning? So if you want to just take a moment and type that in. And I'll share with you your responses as they come in. So you should be able to see some of the things that people have on their minds. The larger you see it on the screen, the more similar responses. So working with my son who has ADHD, frustration, accountability, stress, socialization, motivation. Talk about that. Effectiveness, individualization, social emotional learning. Yes, that's important. And Doug talked about that as well. Engagement. Good. Okay. Well, that'll help me have an idea of where we're all at and some of the things that I can focus on and linger on. Thank you for sharing. Okay. So one of the first things, and I saw it up on your screen, that I have learned with my experience in working with parents in distance learning programs and homeschool is the question of motivation. Like, how do we motivate our students, right? So we've already talked about, as parents, you're wearing multiple hats. And distance learning does remove some of those systems of accountability that exist in a physical classroom. Like, one of our greatest tools that we have as a teacher in a physical classroom is the use of proximity in working with students. But now that our students are distance learning, they are going to need some additional systems of motivation. And so one of the things that we can think about is being able to offer them voice and choice. And so that's a really important way that we can empower our students, where they feel like they have some sort of control over their learning, and when they're given options, again, they're more motivated. And so, for example, instead of saying something like, would you like to do your math today or not? That's not really a viable option, right? So when we give options to our students, we want to try to give them two choices. And those two choices both need to be acceptable with us, whichever one that they choose. And they, of course, need to fit with our value system. So either one needs to be okay with us. So instead of saying, for example, do you want to do your math today or not? Then you might say, would you like to do your math today before lunch or after lunch? Or would you like to do your math first or your reading first? And if they're working on math, you might say, would you like to start with the odd problems or the even problems? Use the blue crayon or the red pen? So the idea is that we're giving them choice. It empowers them. They feel like they're taking ownership, but either one is acceptable, and both choices were ones that we had planned for anyway. So voice and choice is really important for student motivation. Using positive reinforcement is just another really important resource that we have. So this is Classroom Management 101, right? So as teachers and teacher preparation programs, we are trained to consistently use positive reinforcement. But our students in this distance learning time, they just need some additional reinforcement from you as parents, while they're starting to develop and increase their own intrinsic motivation and the motivation that they'll receive from their teachers as well. So a couple of tips related to this. One is always describe the behavior in terms of the outcome that you want to see. So in a classroom, that looks like, boy, students, I like the way that you all have your materials together and you're ready to start class. And in a classroom, you start to see, once the teacher says that, all of the students are scrambling to get their materials together because they want to be the one that's being recognized, and they don't want to be any different than anybody else. So when you have siblings at home, it's going to be great because kids are competitive. So when you say something like that, Johnny, I like the way you've got your materials all ready, and you're ready for a teacher to start that session. And then the siblings will jump right in and do the same thing. So avoid negative commands and always describe the behavior in terms of what you want to see, and you'll get more of that behavior. Along the same lines, you don't want to punish the behavior you want to see, right, either. So if Johnny has trouble getting his materials ready and getting himself ready for class to start on a regular basis, but then he does it, you don't want to say something like, why can't you do that all the time? Right? So we want to recognize and acknowledge even those steps that they're taking towards demonstrating that behavior that we want them to display on a regular basis. So always use positive reinforcement. And even things, when I was homeschooling my own kids and other homeschool parents, I used sticker charts, and people have a variety of different opinions about that, but just as simple as me having a sticker chart in front of my student while they're working independently or while they're engaged in an online class, and I just walk by and I just acknowledge that they're focused. I acknowledge that they're paying attention, and I don't necessarily want to interrupt them. So I just put a sticker on their chart, recognizing that the behavior that they're exhibiting right now, that's the behavior that I would like to encourage and continue to see. And when they get their sticker chart all filled up, then, you know, maybe there's a reward in place. Our kids do need some rewards and some additional motivation to help them through this distance learning. Here's just some examples of things that we might say instinctively on a regular basis, but I would encourage you to think about ways in which we could say them maybe a little bit better, right? So instead of saying, for example, do your schoolwork, we might say something like, are you going to do your math now or your reading? Or instead of turn to page 45 in your math book, we might just simply say, so we're starting on page 45 today. Instead of stop bickering with each other, and I don't know if that happens in your household, but it did in mine, you might say something like, can you stay with us and stop doing that? Or do you need a little leave for a little while and come back when you're able to be sweet? Or are you guys going to stop bickering? Are you going to pay me in order to listen to it? We use a reward system with stickers, or you know, you can do buttons in a jar, or any type of reward system that you might have, or even just this one. So instead of saying take a 15-minute recess, that's great, right? But what if we had planned to give our kids a 15-minute recess, but we say something like, should we take a 10-minute break, or do you need an extra 5 minutes to run around? Like, it's so powerful, right? So we intended on giving them a 15-minute break, but instead we made it sound like we were going to give them an extra 5 minutes for good behavior, or just because we recognize that they might need it. So our language and the way that we say things can be really, really helpful. So as Doug mentioned, the right environment is important as well. And so you need to think about that your students are going to have times of their day where they have synchronous instruction as well as asynchronous instruction. So there are going to be those times in synchronous instruction where it's live and they're engaging with their teacher and their students in a live session. And then there'll also be the times when they're asked to work independently, bookwork, and maybe it's on a screen, or maybe it's, you know, paper and pen. But think about the environment, what's right for each of those situations. And so think about your child's personality as a starting point. Think about those times where your student needs a little more interaction, or they might need a little bit of privacy. As Doug mentioned, vacuuming. I've had students where their parents are vacuuming in the background. I've also had dad walk through, not, you know, fully dressed. And so there are times when you might need privacy in these online sessions. But as the anchor yesterday, when we did a live segment on 5, she talked about the fact that she has her student all set up for a live session, and then she walks away and he starts to play video games. It happens, right? So we need to be able to provide accountability as well as offer privacy, eliminate distractions, but still be present and available. So think about those things. If you need distance between you and your kids, if you're in a meeting or something like that, where the TV isn't blaring. The right environment. And then in addition to that, getting organized. And so that's thinking about how the student has access to their materials, how you're going to help keep track of the work that's been assigned, what's completed and what's not. As Doug mentioned, it's really important as parents that we appreciate your partnership and being able to help provide feedback to students. Doug talked about Dr. Hattie's research, and one of the some of his research that shows greatest effect size with relationship to student achievement has to do with feedback. And so having students have access to immediate feedback, valuable feedback, is really important to move their learning along. And how will students keep track of their time? Like, do you want them to have a phone near them so that they can see what time it is? Or perhaps, a wall clock would be better. Or for younger students, maybe a stopwatch or even a sand timer so that they can kind of keep track of time. So think about those things with relationship to getting organized. And even to something about your printer. So maybe you don't, if your students need to print something, but perhaps you're working while your students are distance learning and you're in a meeting. If your printer is where you are located, maybe you don't want them coming in and interrupting you while because they need to print something. Another thing to think about is with relationship to establishing routines. Doug talked about how routines are still important. And then there's scheduling. And so here's my best suggestion. I love Post-it notes. And I think it works fantastically when you have a different colored Post-it note for every member of the family, and that you have a schedule that shows what each member of the family is doing. So not just your students, but yourself as well. So your students are going to be able to see you. You're modeling for them, and you're one of their most important teachers just in the way that you're working and the way that you're modeling for them. So when you have meetings or when you have big assignments and projects, those things should be on the schedule as well. And remember that you have appointments. So there are times when your students are going to be scheduled for a live session with their teacher, or maybe a dance lesson on Zoom or something like that. And so there are appointments, but then there are also assignments, and those can be done at any time. And so I recommend that your schedule include both, that you write everything down on a Post-it note, an appointment as well as assignments that they must do, and even things that they may do, right? And then you organize it. Include yourself. So again, that they know what's going on, and they can recognize that you're busy too. You know, even if it's prep dinner, that should be on there as well. And then you have a lot of flexibility. And so your schedule might look like, when everything's on a Post-it note, you can move things around. And so I suggest things like alternating hard and then easy. So if your student really struggles in math, think about too, what's the best time of day for them? Is it morning or is it right after lunch? And alternate something hard with something that's a little bit easier. Think about what time of the day your students are best, and then tackle the hardest ones at that time. I also think it's important during this time for us to think about screen time, and we don't want our students on the screen all day, right? So alternate those activities that they're doing that require them to be on the screen with something that doesn't require them to be on the team. And then, or on the screen rather. And then think too about what things that you can do together. So are there times when you need to be reading emails and then they can be on their computer, or you're reading for a particular assignment or reading for pleasure if you're not working at the same time, and then they can be reading as well. So think about that when you're building the schedule. And then there are some things that can be written down, and then there are some things that that will change. And remember, when you're building the schedule, to also build in recess. That's really important. Kids have recess, and if it's a sticky on the schedule, you can move it around, and you can reschedule it at different times, and the students know it's coming, and they look forward to it. They need brain breaks to get their blood flowing and to get so it doesn't all pull to their seat, so that they can run around. There's lots of things that you can do with movement and song and help your students refocus. Run to the wall and back, quickly do 10 jumping jacks, hop on your foot 10 times, do a crab walk, talk like a pirate. So many things, right? Another really great idea is to have timeouts. So like in football, my husband's a big football fan, and each team gets 2 timeouts that they can take. I think that's right? During the game. And so you can even make a sticky note for a timeout. And if your student, for example, they recognize internally that they just need to stop, reset, refocus, they're getting a little overwhelmed, whatever it is, they need a little break, it's not scheduled, then they can just choose to take their timeout at that time. And then they've got 2 of them coming, or however many you decide. And then you'll find that they have an opportunity to self-regulate, kind of be more self-aware of their learning, but they're not taking timeouts consistently always, and taking advantage of that. And of course, make time for family fun and getting outdoors. I also recommend that you have things nearby. We call them busy bins, but things that students can have access to where they can work independently. In a classroom, these might look like centers. And these are things that students can do when they finish early, or when you want to limit screen time. And so you can make these exciting, you can make them novel, you can have repeated things in there, but in this example, you've got some for specific days of the week. You also have specific activities. These are great too if you are working and your students are distance learning, and you get that unexpected phone call that you need to attend to, and there's something urgent and pressing that needs your attention. Then if you're working alongside your student at that time, if you need to step away in the moment, you don't want them to necessarily, have it be a free-for-all, or go play a video game, or whatever it is that they might do, turn on the TV. So you can direct them to one of these bins. And it's something for them to look forward to. There's also, you can put in there, Doug mentioned the importance of practice. So things like flashcards or leveled readers, if you have the younger students at home, things, memorizing poetry, those kinds of things that are really important and good for them for practice. So this is what that schedule then might look like. So again, I just love it that it's Post-it notes. Each person is on it. Also too, if you've scheduled a task and the student doesn't finish it, then it needs to be rescheduled. It needs to either replace some other activity or it needs to get moved forward to the next day. And when you're using the Post-it notes, it's a really easy way for you to be able to do that. And it'll also help you learn. When you're creating the schedule with your students, it might take a little time at first, but it'll get easier. And you can be really intentional in thinking about how long realistically should this task take, or this activity, or this assignment the teacher's given. And then you are able to communicate with the teacher. If, for example, the teacher's told you that it should take about an hour, you scheduled it for an hour, and your student is halfway done, you know, is your student struggling, or you know, what is it? How do you redirect, refocus? And so this schedule with that flexibility can be really helpful. And then just also the importance of connecting. So your presence with your kids is a present to them. And so how can you remain connected and you're still with the teacher? It's a great opportunity for parents and teachers and students to really connect and partner with one another. And the other thing that I think too is a challenge for kids in distance learning is they don't have access to they don't have the community and the collaboration that exists in the physical classroom with their classmates, right? So I think it's important for students to be able to have an opportunity to ask questions whenever they come of mind. And so I make a suggestion as simple as, like you see there, just a parking lot. It could be a poster board on your wall. And again, I'm a Post-it note fan. So when your student has a question and you're just not immediately available, you're not sitting there next to your student, but they can ask that question and then they can just go post it in the parking lot. And then they feel like they've engaged. They can move on and they can move past it and continue their work independently, but they've set it aside and given it a place. They can write down requests that they have of you, something interesting that they've learned. And then make sure that you're interested and that you're checking in and you revisit it at the end of the day. And maybe it's the other parent that wasn't home with the student all day, right? And maybe the other parent is gonna come in and just check out the parking lot, answer questions that the student has, get them the materials that they need. It's a really great way to have a holding place for your students to just remain connected and for you to remain connected with them. And that's along the same lines of feedback. So I talked a lot about the importance of feedback in Hattie's research. And so it's the #1 factor in student achievement. So your feedback along with your teachers is going to be invaluable. So you want to help them check things off with what they've completed so they know what it is that they need to do. You want to help them reflect. You want to, and the kind of feedback that teachers give that's really valuable is glows and grows, things that the student did really well, you know, things that they need to work on. That type of feedback is the most valuable for our students. And so these are the kinds of things that you can ask your student when you're checking in with them, things that you might ask them in the morning, things that you might ask them at the end of the school day. And there's a focus and an emphasis on the learning as much as the student's performance, because that's really what we want to encourage, right? So asking them what their goals are for the day, or what they think that they might struggle with. So they're anticipating that in advance. And you can be, you know, forward in helping them. You can be proactive, finding out what resources they need, asking the student what he or she is most looking forward to, like creating some anticipation and some excitement, enthusiasm about what the day has in store. And at the end of the day, you know, asking about the learning again, what was the most exciting thing that you did today? Did you accomplish your goals? And if there were some struggles, let it go and just ask, well, what can we do differently tomorrow? And we just remember it's always a process and we're just getting better and better as we go along. Constant reinforcement. And here I just put this up there, reading is the most important thing. If all else fails, I am a big advocate and proponent of read aloud with kids. And so pick up a book and just read aloud. Find a great book, a chapter book or a picture book that you can just read aloud to your kids on a regular basis. It causes you and forces you to stop and really be present, because you can't be multitasking on your phone or doing house chores or anything else while you're reading to your child. And it's the best way that we can engage with them. In a classroom, it's always been really popular. It's not as much anymore as I wish it was. We call it deer time, and it just means drop everything and read. And teacher did it, kids did it, everybody did it. So that's always a go-to. And then in wrapping up, I just want to reiterate, Doug talked about, partnering with the teacher. And so really know what the teacher's office hours are. The distance learning teacher is available. And again, I am a distance learning teacher right now. So I have posted office hours. My students and my parents know when they can contact me, and when, whether chat or a phone call or email or jump into a Google Hangout. Make sure you take the time to be really familiar with your child's e-learning platform. And so you know how to check the gradebook, you know how to check the feedback that the teacher's providing. It's so important, and it helps you partner with them. It shows your student that their education and what they're learning is important to you, and you can better support them. So take some time up front and become really familiar with it. If the school's provided, parent orientations and parent resources, then make sure that you acknowledge those. And I know that learning from home can be difficult, but it's definitely achievable. So I just want to encourage you to not only show up, but be a really great role model. And sometimes you might feel like you're alone, but you're really not. And so if you have any additional questions, or if I can be of additional service, there's my email, Twitter, Facebook. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing all that. And we're moving on now to the next speaker. Benna Kellick is a professional consultant and co-founder and co-director of the Institute for Habits of Mind, whose mission is to transform schools into learning communities where thinking and habits of mind are taught, practiced, valued, and infused into the culture. Benna has co-authored many books and articles on habits of mind, and she and her Habits of Mind co-founder are recipients of the Malcolm Knowles Award from the International Society for Self-Directed Learning. So Benna will begin her presentation now. And I just wanted to say something really quickly. Sorry, I saw that a couple people put in comments in the Q&A and the chat, but they're not quite worded as questions. So if you have a question about those things you messaged about, please feel free to ask it in the form of a question so I can ask the speakers at the end. Thank you.
Well, that was really a lot of great information. So I'm going to try my best not to repeat anything, and maybe give you another spin on some of the things that are really most important for your kids. And I would call them, based on my work with Art Costa, we call them habits of mind. And habits of mind are those habits that you need when you're confronted with challenging situations. It's the kind of thing, it's the kind of habit you would call upon when you're really not sure what to do. What am I being asked to do? And I'm not sure about that. Which habits of mind would help me most? So we begin to say that they're also the ones that help us in terms of feeling the social and emotional connection with others. So with all of that in mind, I put this chart up as the 16 habits, and I also put in the chat the website so that you could go and you could find the 16 habits. You can find materials that are related to it. And if you go to the About Us of the Habits of Mind website, you'll see that Art Costa and I have written a paper on habits of mind that's directly appropriate for parents, as well as another one that's very appropriate for teachers and all appropriate for anyone who wants to read them. So it kind of gives you a little bit more information about what we mean when we say a habit. So what we mean when we say a habit, what we're really saying is, for example, as we heard Jackie and Doug also talking about this, one of the things that they said was, well, you have to be ready to understand that learning is a process and that often it is one in which you're not always right. So what happens if, for example, you're striving for accuracy and then you find that you really aren't sure what you're doing and you really need some help? So you might say, well, what can I do? So this is the kind of what we would call the metacognitive conversation inside your head. What can I do now? Because I'm trying to get this right, but I keep seeing from checking the answers, my answer is not the right answer. So what can I do about this? Oh, maybe I can be applying past knowledge to this situation. What do I already know about problems like this? If I made this into a simpler problem, Would that help me solve it? So I begin to think about, what do I already know and how might that help me to solve this problem? So that's one where I'm using math as an example. But we might also say that when we're reading a story, we might say, oh, these stories are really interesting, but look at how many different points of view there are. So if I'm thinking flexibly, I might say, let me see what it's like if I take the point of view of, for example, the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood. What would that look like? I wonder what it felt like to the wolf to be the one who was really interested in getting after this little girl. So that you begin to say, I understand. There's more than one way of seeing things. So we're constantly thinking about the habits of mind and how they help us to actually become more effective as thinkers, as problem solvers, and as just also being able to notice what's going on in the world and observe it in new ways. So to do that, I was thinking about many times when we work with parents, talking about habits of mind with your family. What might it look like, for example, with striving for accuracy in your family, if you were to say, tonight we're going to set the table, we'll be striving for accuracy. Let's see now, what would be the first thing we'd put on the table? What would be the second thing? Where do the forks go? Where do the knives go? So notice that it's not always about your academic world that you're thinking about, although that's critically important, but it's about the world that they're living in as well. Where do you look for striving for accuracy? Another would be in your family, if you were to say, I want to use the language of habits of mind. So as we suggested, some problems are really tough to do. So when you have a problem that's tough, and I would say to you, hey, hang in there, don't give up, you need to persist. I'm using the language. Many teachers have this for students all the time, where they might say, we need to be managing our impulsivity. Now that's a big mouthful for young children, but young children, of course, love very sophisticated language, and they get used to that very easily. And older students certainly understand managing your impulsivity. And we give them a simple way of thinking about it. We say, how about just stop and think before you act? So you're managing your impulsivity. Then you might say, how do you know if you're right? Are you striving for accuracy? So it's another way to look at this. Here's the way some students who were in middle school wrote about it when the teacher said, so tell me a little bit about what you did when you were in remote distance learning, in which you were actually persisting and striving for accuracy. So this student talked about how she did it when she was baking cookies. This one talked about persisting when he was trying to learn how to use the skateboard. Now, the most important thing that I'm recommending here is that you really see that these habits are habits you need in life. They're not just the skills for school, they're the skills for life. And so anticipate situations where you want to remind students about it. For example, when grandma comes, she may have a little difficulty understanding what you're saying. So there are two things we might say. One would be sure you listen to her with understanding and empathy. Make sure you pay attention to her. Another would be, as you're solving this problem, what's going on inside your head? Are you thinking about your thinking? Or, I saw that you were really nervous about taking that chance on the skateboard, but go ahead, you can take a responsible risk. Notice everything that we're doing when we're external to the academic situation is really not external to the academic situation, because you're really trying to build the habits of effective thinking, and they come about everywhere. So we use them as language, as a reminder when we're deciding, when we're trying to get something done. I thought you might like to see this one. This is from some parents who decided they were going to have their kids do a noticing notebook. And so they said they're going to take responding with wonderment and awe. And they had the students go out, their children and other children, and then they shared them. What did you observe? And so the children went out, observed, took pictures, wrote a little piece about it, and then they shared it with some of their friends. I think it was Doug who talked about the importance of remembering you do have friends, you're still in a social network, and maybe there are some things that you can share. Responding with wonderment and awe is a wonderful way to think about that, building that habit. And so these children decided that what they were going to do was they were going to find out what their neighbors were doing. So they wrote and they said, "Dear Mrs. Jones, in school, we learn about habits of mind which people need to use when they face challenges. I'm writing this note to you using the habit of responding with wonderment and awe. You amaze me because," so that they wrote to them and said, "Here's something, it's just a note." And what happened was that they started exchanging notes back and forth. Now, if you're concerned about the fact of the paper and maybe you shouldn't be exchanging paper, there's also the possibility that you do this via email. But the point is the connections are very important. So I'm just talking very fast because I know that we only have 5 minutes and you probably have questions. I guess the thing that I would say most importantly is what I think Jackie ended with, which is modeling. And don't worry that your children don't listen to you. Worry that they're always watching you. So your behavior matters. And the more that you can embrace and become used to the habits of mind, as they were explicitly used in some of the presentations with Doug and with Jackie, think about them for yourself. The language that you use really matters. The way that you behave really matters, probably more than almost anything else. That's the way that you are their first teacher.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Benna, for sharing that information. Right now, we will go to the Q&A questions, but first of all, we wanted to just give you guys a quick poll. We wanted to see how you as parents are doing with distance learning. It will show up on your Zoom, but it'll just take a few seconds and all the results will be anonymous, but we just wanted to, just see how parents are doing really quickly. So yeah, if you don't mind filling that out really quick. Okay, great. And so while we're doing that poll, I guess I will just start with the questions. So looking at the chat and our list. So one of the first questions is, if your child needs extra examples for math subjects, are there videos you suggest to help aid in their understanding?
Yes. I would probably point first to the Khan Academy. It's free and it goes down to preschool in the area of math and a whole bunch of others, but it's totally free. And you can search it by topic of what the teacher's teaching. And there's all kinds of additional examples.
Great.
I couldn't agree more. You could also search by standard if you know what that is too, but yeah, great resource.
Okay, great. Another question we have is, how important is it for our 4-year-old to attend preschool versus the safety considerations?
Versus what? I missed the last piece of that question.
The safety considerations?
Oh.
You know, these are very difficult decisions that families are making right now. It depends on the preschool. What do you have trust and faith in their procedures? How many kids are in the preschool? You know, there's just so many considerations to think through as a family. What are your other risk factors in your family's life? What's the trade-off if the child goes to preschool? What will you be able to do for the family? So I don't think there is a hard and fast rule on this. If it's necessary, I don't think it's a risk if the child doesn't go to preschool. I would focus at home on language learning, talking, definitely reading throughout the day to the child and talking about it. So if we can get language moving, if we can get vocabulary growing, if we get this idea that books have information, if we start looking at, depending on the age, counting things, permanent objects, like this is 1, this is 2, you know, those kinds of things, we're going to be good to go.
I would also include purposeful play, because kids need to play. And I think that if you just make sure, you know, your block building, your Legos, all of those things are mathematical opportunities. So there's lots of things that if kids get used to using play and using materials and just making observations about it, you're going a long way with them. 4 years old, play matters.
Okay, great. One reader asked, I've heard a rule of thumb, age times 5 minutes equals roughly how long someone can stay on task. How long do you think a child can stay focused in a remote classroom environment?
Jacqueline, you want to start on that?
Yeah, so that is a good rule of thumb. So age times 5 minutes. It really, there are so many things that have the potential to distract a student in distance learning as they do in the classroom. So it could be if their pet dog is wandering around the room, or the TV's on, or their sibling. And so there are other things that are going to be distractions to them. So if you can eliminate all of the distractions and the student is able to attend to just what's going on in the virtual classroom, it could be close to what typical attention times are. Would you agree, Doug?
Yes. And I'm actually, so I hear a range. I've heard as low as your age in minutes to a high of your age times 5 in minutes. But there is a ceiling effect. And as far as we can tell in the research, there is no ability to teach attention span. No ability. What instead we can teach is self-regulation. So choosing to come back to the learning environment. So that's where I would spend my energy. And I think, the teachers know this. And so pandemic teaching wasn't always amazing, a lot of one-way transmission. But as we got better at this, we got to change up our actions a lot. Talk to a partner, let's call on a student, let's raise our hands, use the reaction buttons, all those things we started to see to recapture the learner back into the learning environment. Use a breakout room, come back in 3 minutes, anything. I think, and I was hearing the two of you talk about screen time. I'm mixed on the research on this. I used to be more worried about it, but I've done a lot of reading in the last 2 months, and I'm mixed on this about how good or bad it is for us. But I do think visual field is important. So I think the teacher's, okay, I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at this monitor, now I need to take notes, or now I need to listen to someone and write down, or now I need to work on a problem and come back. So changing their visual field also works on attention and gets their eyes away from always this distance, because they're still developing. And we need them to be looking far away, looking close up, looking down, looking away. So we need to change that visual field as well.
I think it's also important to remember that what we call metacognition, being aware of your thinking, or our habit, we call it thinking about your thinking, is very important. So self-awareness is really critical in all of this also. And kids can tell you what they can tolerate, and they can also tell you what strategies they might use to help them to take a break. What strategy works best for you? I think awareness of self-awareness of what strategy works for you, what seems to help you most, what kinds of things might you do, so that you become more an agent of your own learning. Yeah. Because I think a lot of this is also about their being able to manage themselves and take responsibility for themselves. I saw also that you're asking about teenagers, and you're saying, what do you recommend to help teenagers with socialization? Because you're also concerned about that, obviously. And a lot of what we talked about was really sort of self-paced learning. Not that any of us believes that's the only way, but that was kind of a little bit of the focus. And I'm sure we all also think a lot about project-based learning. How do you really develop projects with students? And how do you help them find each other? And how might they do a project together interdependently? So maybe, Doug, maybe you want to talk about that. I know you do a lot of work with it.
Yeah, I think we should, I think increasing choice, increasing self-assessment, and teaching kids to seek out feedback so we can set up, I think you're going to see teachers saying, here's some learning we have to do, here are the options for you to learn this. I think we're going to see way more of that, engaging in that regulation work and seeing more choice. So I think that's going to be useful. And I think thinking about your thinking, as Benna was talking about, if we can ask students, how did you figure that out? What was the process you used to solve that? That's the kind of interactions be really powerful, rather than did you get it right or wrong? So I think that there's lots of resources out there about elevating the thinking time that they have. And for teenagers, socialization, I think that you all have to say what's safe for you. In my neighborhood, I live on a cul-de-sac. On Fridays, there is a dance party. All the adults, all the families here draw circles, and that's where the teenagers have to stay in their circle. They're all distance apart, and they play music, and they have a great time, and they're talking to each other, but they stay in their circle because that's what we've decided as our neighborhood is. They can have their dance party every Friday night. They stay in their little circle 6 feet away, and they love it, and they're all talking about it, and it's like, whenever we go back to school, we're still doing this because it's really, really fun. And so I think as families, we have to think about what kinds of things can we do to socialize that are safe, that we're not concerned are going to cause this to get worse.
Okay, great. Another question we got is, how do you discipline young children to sit in front of the computer while the teacher is giving class instruction?
Jacqueline, you want to start?
I'll just start by saying first, I mean, this is two ways. First of all, the teacher needs to take responsibility for how engaging his or her instruction is. So it's really important for us to not just be, as Doug mentioned, maybe what might have been happening in the spring in some situations is this was new and everyone was learning, to be just talking at the students. But there's so much that we can do to engage them through polling and through the way that we activate the content on our slides and through breakout sessions and small groups and pair share. So there are a lot of things that we can do. And that's really important for us as teachers, is to interact with and engage your students. That's our primary focus. And so, I mean, we've talked a lot about self-regulation, and it is important for us as teachers and as parents to be able to help to cultivate that in our kids and to demonstrate it and to talk about it so that their self-regulation skills will improve and they're able to attend and focus, better. So it's really, that's a shared responsibility, and I would say primarily the responsibility of the instructor. And then all of those other tricks that we gave as far as environment and workplace, all of those other things that we've already talked about will help.
We're also seeing a whole bunch of virtual classroom jobs. And so if your child needs some help paying attention for increasing amounts of time or attending to this kind of learning, maybe ask the teacher, what classroom jobs could this, for this age, do? Could you be the brain break monitor? Could you be the success monitor? Could you be the greeter? What could you do? Because what we see in physical schools, when kids have jobs, they develop some leadership, they develop some responsibility. And for some kids, it helps them attend a little bit longer because they know they're going to have a role in this class.
I love that.
Great. Okay. And then the last question that I see, this is one we got leading up to the webinar via email. It says, how will schools repair the harm caused by distance learning on English learners, students of poverty, refugees, and students with special needs in the spring when schools were not prepared? So I know you're not necessarily speaking for the schools themselves, but yeah, I was just wondering if you could share any thoughts on that, or yeah.
I suspect you're going to see all kinds of acceleration efforts. I suspect you're going to see lots of efforts to assess kids where they are and where they need to grow. I think the school systems here are working so hard to address the equity issues. I mean, like one district, more than 50,000 laptops went out in one school system. I mean, it's just, it's difficult. I understand that. And we were surprised by the sheer volume of what we had to do. When we first closed schools, I was thinking 3 weeks. I really thought, like, we'll be back in 3 weeks. And who knows when we'll be back. Some schools districts are talking about coming back now as San Diego went off the list, and then we might go back on the list, all this stuff. But that's our job. Our job is to say, this is where the kid is right now. I cannot make excuses for the past. This is where the kid is. What can we do to accelerate learning for this kid? If we fall in the trap of remediation and set up this deficit mindset, we're going to have lower expectations. We have to work to accelerate where that kid is now.
I think if we go back though, and since we're talking to parents about this really, and what Doug is saying is clearly in the realm of what we can do as educators, as teachers, as people who are doing that work. But as parents, I would say there are some really good things that you can do. For example, if English is not your first language, that doesn't matter. You can still really do some wonderful things. For example, reading in your language, reading out loud in your language would be wonderful. But I've also seen people take books without words. So for example, there are graphic novels or graphic books without words, and you can exchange with your child and they can tell you the story that's going on. And you might then mirror it in the language of your natural language or your first language. There are ways that you can use those observations, go out and take a walk. The whole idea of building vocabulary, building reading, building mindfulness, being able to be attentive to what's going on, all of that is really not language defined. And although language, if you're going to be in an English speaking country, obviously you need to be able to speak English, but I don't think that it's necessarily a deficit as long as you keep the richness of the mind going and you keep the interest in and curiosity of the mind going. I think you're doing a lot already. And as Doug said, I truly believe from everything that I've seen, we're working super hard as educators to look at the question of equity, especially now with all of the issues that are going on in terms of the way the virus is also affecting people of poverty, people of color. And we're seeing that this is really a very unequal kind of arrangement all the way around for everyone, and trying to figure out what we can do about that. But I would still say there's a lot of life out there, and it's important to remember that and not feel like it's, to our deficit. If we can just respond with wonderment and awe and gratitude that we're alive, that we're here, that we're in this moment, and that it's probably, as I've said to some of the students that I've worked with, look at the diary of Anne Frank and you'll see how amazing it is that if you keep a journal or a diary of what's going on, you are living through a period of history that will be remembered and people will want to know about it, and you are a primary source information of that. So don't forget, it is your life right now that will be of interest to others, and journal it, think about it, talk about it, because it's really so valuable. We are in a moment, we're not in our lifetime.
Okay, great. And I think that's all the questions that I saw in the chat, but I just was wanting to ask my own question really quickly, since I've been hearing this from parents as well. But do you have any advice for parents who are working from home or are essential workers and they have to go out to work? Just how do you juggle the time that's involved in homeschooling with if you're working full time?
Jackie, you probably have the most experience with that one.
That is where I tried to focus. Most of my content was for that. I'll say, first of all, the difference between homeschooling and distance learning. So homeschooling, the parent is taking on the role as educator, primary educator. So they are teaching and providing all of the instruction. But in distance learning, there's still a teacher. And so all of those things, partnering with the teachers, some of those strategies that I tried to give as far as scheduling your own time if you need to be in a meeting or doing something, and then knowing what your students are doing. But really the most important thing is recognizing and try to be able to be proactive in what your students are going to need support with and what they can do independently. And teachers are able to share that with you. They're able to say this, they're providing direct instruction and providing opportunities for guided practice where students are practicing the newly learned material and they have the support of the teacher. And then the students move into independent practice. And so that's where they are expected to be able to do it independently. So if the parent has awareness of that through discussion with their student as well as with the teacher, then those are the expectations that we can have as parents as far as knowing what our students should be able to do independently and then what they're going to need help with so that we can plan accordingly.
And I would add the reality is, sorry, Jackie.
Go ahead.
I was going to add the reality is someone has to be supervising the child up to a certain age, right? So we are seeing some very small little pods where someone, there might be 5 different grade levels represented, but someone's there We're seeing more grandparents, aunts and uncles coming together. And that's a challenge. The reality is, if you're a 5-year-old or you're a 7-year-old, someone has to be home with you. And so how we do that, one district in the South, for essential workers, they're going to go to school and they're going to be spread around, even though the teachers won't be there. They can be at school supervised. Not all districts can do that, but I mean, this is one of the challenges. How can we support each other in this community as we ensure that kids don't learn less this year, that we actually seize this moment to make sure kids are learning a lot?
Okay, great. I think to be respectful of our speakers' time, we will end the webinar now. They have already shared so much great information with us, but we really appreciate all three of your time and your expertise. Thank you so much. And if you have time, if you could chat, message in the chat, just a good email address or the best way that attendees can contact you if they have any more questions, that'd be great. But just a reminder, yes, next week we will have our next webinar on Wednesday, and that one will be about special education. So we encourage you to sign up for that one as well. And like we've said in the chat, the recording of this webinar will be posted on our webpage along with the presentation slides, so you can see all that information there if you missed anything. And I will also be working on a tip sheet based off of what the experts gave us in terms of advice. So we will also post a tip sheet on our website. But yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen and ask questions, but we really appreciate it and hope to see you next week. But thank you.
Bye.